But this is Denmark, and Copenhagen is here. And if you wonder why we put that on the sort of the outskirts of the nation, it's because Denmark used to be bigger, so it used to be in the center of the nation, but not anymore. And my university college covers this area, and we educate teachers, preschool teachers, nurses, physiotherapists, designers, engineers, and also accountants, actually. So we have 18, almost 20,000 students, and most of them, they do 4-year bachelor programs. If you want to know more about VIA, we have an English website. I don't know the exact address for the English version, but I know that if you log on to the Danish one, there'll be an English flag that you can click on. Yes, I guess it's okay to take clarifying questions as we go along, but I have planned that we have at least half an hour for discussions afterwards. So please wait for that. So this is the outline of my talk today. I will introduce you to this READ project, and I will be discussing this big call for evidence and education that we see in Denmark, and that I'm sure is something that you can relate to in an Australian context, as I try to place this READ project within this broader discussion about the role of evidence and what counts as evidence in education. And then I'll talk you through, as I said, the theoretical underpinnings, the methodology, and hopefully I'll also have time to go into the data collection where we collect the 3,000 texts and how we coded them. And finally, some of the preliminary results and perspectives from this project. Oh, the READ project. As I said, this is a large-scale pedagogical experiment, and it aims at rising literacy results in year 2 and 3. And it's an at-home intervention, so it's actually a tool that we have developed that schools can use in their cooperation with parents. So it's developed for parents, but it's supposed to be used by the schools. So it's a tool that aims at giving teachers a way of relying information about literacy education, about literacy development to parents, and actually give these teachers a very concrete tool that parents can use in the home when they want to support and help their children's reading development. It is informed by the works of Vygotsky, but also by the works of Halliday and Painter and Rakaya Hassan, which I know many of you are familiar with, and I'll say a little bit more about that when I come to that part of the presentation. It is partly funded by the city of Aarhus, which is the second largest city of Denmark, which is here, which is also where my teacher education program is based. It's the second largest city, and it has 300,000 inhabitants, more or less. And almost 90% of the kids in Aarhus, they actually go to the state school, so they go to the publicly funded school. So that's a bit over the Danish average. We have 3,000 children in this study, and 29 out of 46 of the municipality schools in Aarhus actually participated. And as I said, what we have tried to do is to develop a tool that these 29 schools can use when they want to help parents support their children's literacy development in the home. It's a huge project. I've already said we have 3,000 children involved in the project, so of course it's not my work alone, far from actually. So it's a cross-disciplinary and also a cross-institutional project. And I have to, normally you would acknowledge all the people working in the project, but it's simply too big, and we have, I think, 3 PhD students. We have a lot of master students working on it as well. But our project leaders, they come from the University of Aarhus, and they come from a place called Trygfonden Center for Child Research. That is based at the Department of Economics and Business. And I want to, that's an interesting point, because this shows this very significant shift in educational research that has been taking place in Denmark throughout the last years. Trygfonden is actually a private foundation. It has made a lot of money on insurance, and they wanted to boost educational research. So they had this call, and the winner was Department of Economics and Business. I think it's a significant, it's a significant turn because in Aarhus, that means that the biggest educational research group is now at the Department of Economics. So people from the Department of Economics are now leading the educational research in the city of Aarhus. That's a significant shift in where the money goes in educational research. The city of Aarhus, Department for Children and Young People, also funded part of it, and so did my college, of course. So the project leaders come from the Department of Business and Economics at the university. So it means that it was, as a project, it was designed by them, and then people from literacy, the field of literacy and the field of education were invited in to qualify the intervention and the project as such. And I'll tell you more about the role we had in it later on. So I want to make a few points about why this kind of study and why this kind of study at this point in time, because it is a very it is a so-called evidence study. There's a big call for evidence in Denmark right now. It's a call that comes from both the ministry but also municipalities. And as I said, the municipality actually partly funded this. And I think it's the first time in Denmark that a city has funded research of this scale, at least that I know of. But this is very much in line with the general this general discourse there is in Denmark about educational change and educational leadership. It now has to have a focus. It now has to have a basis in what we call evidence. The ministry and the cities and the schools, they want to know if it works. And the way to find out, according to the Department of Economics, is to do these large-scale interventions. So this kind of study is, of course, the reason for this kind of study is, of course, this general demand for evidence-based research in education. In 2014, we had a major school reform, and that school reform has, as one of its goals, to also implement more evidence-based pedagogies and knowledge in the schools. So, of course, this is very much in line with, the overall pedagogical changes in the Danish system. And this, of course, has to do with the fact that most of the education in Denmark is publicly funded, and it's very expensive. And Denmark, Norway, and Sweden are so-called Nordic welfare states, and it's a very, very expensive model to finance. So there is, of course, a very legitimate demand for knowledge about how can we be more cost-effective. But this concept of evidence in education is, of course, also a criticized. Yeah, the concept of evidence in education is, of course, also very, very criticized and disputed. I'll sort of refer the most important points of view here on both sides. I'm not going to take any sides, as I think both sides have good points to make, but just to frame this discussion that goes on in Denmark at the moment. I'm sure it's very much in line with the current discussion in Australian pedagogy as well. Well, first of all, critics say that best practice has now been institutionalized in Denmark. Denmark has a clearinghouse of education, and their role is to read the literature, do the meta studies, and to provide decision makers, taxpayers, but also researchers and people in education with the best and most reliable knowledge about what works. And critics say that makes what works an institutionalized matter. Hattie is very big in Denmark at the moment, and has been for at least 4 or 5 years, and his focus on outcome-driven, data-driven teaching and learning. And this has led critics to say that especially the German, Northern European tradition of schooling has gone through a very significant change. Normally, our school was oriented towards the content, and the whole the goal of having a big public schooling system was to educate free citizens who would not go to war again. The post-Second World War education system has been very much an education that has been about human rights, respecting minorities for very good reasons, and so on. So it's the why of teaching and the content of teaching that's been in focus in these schooling systems. And that is now shifting, that focus is now shifting to a more technical view of education. Now we're more interested in understanding the how of education, the what works of education. And some critics also point out that now the teachers, the preschool teachers, and their knowledge and their education is now put aside, and they're no longer professionally responsible for what goes on in the classroom. They should be accountable for the outcomes of what goes on in the classroom. So their experience from everyday work of teaching and so on is now put aside, and instead they should look to Hattie, very broadly said, and see what works instead. However, this new evidence-based research has also shed light on some of the problems within this Nordic model. Some of the critics say that, every time we do a meta-study or we do a literature review on what works, no Danish or no Nordic studies actually appear in these reviews. So how can we even be sure that we can transfer the results from what is mostly North American studies to a Danish context? And that is, of course, a good point. But what we can also see from these meta-studies is that there is no empirical tradition in the Nordic schooling system. We've been very good at researching the content, the philosophy about education. There's a very, very strong tradition about philosophy in education, especially in Denmark and Germany. And somewhat we have lost the students. We've lost sight of the students. There's very little research that actually focuses on what the students learn in school, in Denmark and in the Nordic countries especially. And this is obvious when you can see that the first experiment in Denmark is actually from 2011, so it's a very, very recent development. And also external evaluators of the Danish educational system has said this, has pointed this out again and again, that up until the first PISA test that we took part in, and that was in 2000, before that we really didn't know how our students were doing on an international level. We had this idea that we were very good and the Danish students were doing very well, and they were becoming these free and free-thinking individuals. But when we entered the first international, I was going to say competition because that's what it almost is, the first international benchmarking, we came out as the worst in Scandinavia and only mediocre when on an international level. That was a big wake-up call for us. So this focus on outcomes has actually also shedding light on some paradoxes in our schooling system. In 2010, we introduced standardized testing for the first time, and this is a recent study where 2 PhD students actually took all of the students and all of the results and put them together to see how the students are doing in math and reading. They're biannual tests, and they are obligatory for all children in public schools. And as you can see, we have a problem with social stratification in the Danish school system. We wouldn't know this if we didn't have these kind of big data studies. And as you can see, reading and math results, they correlate very systematically and in a very stable way with mother's education, which I'm showing in this, which this figure shows, but we also have one that shows a correlation between the family's income and the reading and math results. And it's exactly the same pattern. And this was a wake-up call when this study came out, because this is very much against the way we understand ourselves as a society and as a schooling system that focuses on equality and social justice. But this actually shows us that the school is part of the society and that the school reproduces the general stratification in society. This is very much in line with what we see in North American studies of the same kind, and there's a big difference between at least how a Nordic welfare system understands itself and then a North American model of society. And if we compare the Danish results to other OECD countries, the student background in Denmark is more important in Denmark, and actually it can actually explain more of the variation than it can in Sweden and Norway. Sweden is unfortunately on the same path as Denmark recently, and Denmark is only on an OECD level here. So again, this was a wake-up call for the Nordic welfare institutions and its institutions. And if we then break down the data a little bit more and look at the difference between immigrants and Danish background students, we can see that the result is even worse. Here we have the pupil ability in reading with from girls and boys with a Danish background, and down here we have girls and boys from a non-Western background. That's quite a substantial divide we have there. And it's the same thing in math. And again, as we see, the differences are stable. What this study also showed was that 2/3, these are not the same students from year 2 to year 8. These are all the students pulled together. But if we look at data from the same student, we only have so far data from 6 years of testing. We can see that 2/3 of all students, they actually remain at the same level throughout 6 years of schooling. So there's not a lot of things happening throughout years of schooling. It's a very depressing result. A lot of things have been done to try to close this gap. The ministry commissioned a program of experiments that are still going on. Now we only have the results from the 2013 experiments. The ministry designed different teaching models, and the aim of these teaching models was to find out which was the more effective in terms of raising literacy and math outcomes among especially bilingual children. Again, as you can see, it's a big study with 126 schools participating. The results were again depressing. If you looked at all the children who took part in the study, they had a significant improvement in their reading outcomes. But the ones who were actually targeted, the bilingual students, had absolutely no effect on them whatsoever. So this tells us that it's hard to target these specific students. They cannot necessarily be targeted with broad interventions that target classes as a whole. And it also showed us that something must change within the pedagogy and within the teaching, because one of these experiments simply gave children 4 more lessons of Danish, thinking that that would improve literacy outcomes. Thinking that I don't know what the thought was, maybe it was that they are a bit slower, the bilingual children, so they simply need more schooling hours. But if the schooling hours that they're already getting are producing these outcomes, then if you give them more hours of that, you will just increase the differences, because it's not the number of hours, it's what actually goes on in there, in the literacy classes. So this tells us that if we want to close the gap, if we want to target these children who are normally difficult to target, we need to understand more about why do we have these kind of statistics in the Danish educational system? Why is class so decisive for learning outcomes? And why is language and class, why are they so closely correlated and so closely correlated with the learning outcomes? So this was the point of departure for our READ study. Just a few more words about what we know about student background, language practices, and reading. I'm sure you're also familiar with these international studies on linguistic variation and reading outcomes. I come from a background in social linguistics, so from social linguistics we know that language varies with social class, but social linguistics only looks at the surface, looks at grammar, looks at pronunciation, and finds these very close correlations with background. But they think about it as something, they think about linguistic variation as linked to identity and identity making. But these studies tell us that there's something more profound going on here. And these studies on vocabulary, they show internationally and in a Danish context that there's a very close correlation between vocabulary size at a very early age and then later reading outcomes. We can see in Danish studies that when they start school, the vocabulary size in grade 0 is actually a very strong predictor for the year 9 results. And a recent study actually moved that predicting power all the way down to 16 to 30 months of age. So very, very early, the vocabulary size at a very early age is actually able to predict later reading outcomes. What did I do now? So sort of to sum up this, you can say that those who start out behind, they also stay behind. They don't catch up once they start school. Other studies have been looking more into this because it's not just a matter of linguistic variation at a superficial level. Something more, we need to know more about why is it that language and learning outcomes are so closely linked to each other, and why is it that student background and linguistic practices and reading practices in the home are also correlated. And one of the studies that we looked at is this very classic study from Heath, but it's an old study. I guess you're all familiar with this, Shirley Bright Heath. Yeah. And what she sees is that there are very clear differences between how books, knowledge, and language and reading is treated in different homes. She has these wonderful descriptions of how middle-class moms, who normally are very much into, shaping the day of their babies. At 8 o'clock we get up, then we have breakfast, and at 7 you have your bath, and then you have your dinner. The only thing that can disrupt that is reading. If the child shows interest in a book, then they can actually postpone the bath and read instead. And this, she says, shows how much books are appreciated. Books are also kept in a safe place, and they should be treated with respect and with they should be treated well and shouldn't be destroyed or just be left around on floors and so on. And her findings say that there are these very substantial differences in how language, learning, and literacy is practiced in these families, and that the school mirrors one of them. So one of these practices actually prepare the kids very efficiently for the later schooling, which doesn't take into account the other children's experiences with language, literacy, and books. Hassan studies, she's also been looking into, I'm sure many of you know her work, but her point of departure was this, I think, very relevant critique of social linguistics and how social linguistics link language and society to each other. And she says, no, we can't look at variation on the surface. We have to look at what kind of experiences do kids have with meaning making, with talking, with learning, with growing up. How are they positioned as speakers, as knowers, and so on in their families? And she takes the point of departure in her notion of code and sees how she can see these semantic variations across classes and children's backgrounds as well. We don't have any studies of this kind in Denmark, unfortunately. We don't know if we have the same kind of variation between children from high or low SES backgrounds, or even what kind of traditions we have in our minority language families around books, reading, language, because nobody has ever done any qualitative studies of this kind. We only have one study that was carried out in a kindergarten, and that showed that there is a very big difference in linguistic practices, not between the children, but between pedagogues. The preschool teachers, they simply meet different children with different linguistic practices. The researcher Paludan, her 2007 is actually English. It's in Journal of Early Childhood Education, I think. She says that in the kindergarten she sees two tones of speaking, two modes of speaking. She calls one the tone of exchange, and that is very much what Hassan also talks about. It's the one that positions the child as somebody who knows something, who can contribute to a conversation, whose meanings matter and whose opinions are valued. Whereas the other tone is a tone of teaching, and there the child is a recipient of not even knowledge but information. And she says the pedagogue, the preschool teacher, will use both tones with all children, but there seemed to be a tendency that especially bilingual children were met with this tone of teaching more than the other children, than non-bilingual children were. And she could also see that it didn't really have anything to do with their linguistic competences. So it was not because the bilingual children was not proficient in Danish, there was something else going on. So we do have some indications of these variation patterns going on in Denmark as well, but we still don't have any qualitative studies from families. So we took a point of departure in these studies, and we tried to work that into our intervention. Because how they characterize this maternal discourse, that is, that positions the child as somebody who contributes, who is a knower, who is praised, not corrected. You can characterize the parent's role like this, and Halliday has done this, and also Claire Painter. I'm sure you're all aware of Claire Painter's work on maternal discourse. So, in designing the project, as I said, it was I'm a little bit aware of time here. Half an hour has gone by, right?
27 minutes.
27 minutes, that's very precise. Yeah. Come across it. So this is what we try to incorporate in this intervention. This is the knowledge that we thought if we can get this knowledge to teachers and they can tell this to the parents, and we can somehow create a tool that can make parents aware of what seems to be a productive and a good way of reading, talking about books, talking about meaning making, talking about language in the home, maybe we can see an effect. And how we did that, I'll show you later on. As I said, this is an experiment, a so-called pedagogical experiment. It's a randomized, controlled study. And that means that we have schools were asked to sign up, so that meant they were interested. Schools were interested in trying out a tool that helps them cooperate with the children. But if we just let them sign up, then we would probably end up in a situation where the schools, where they were more interested in it, or maybe where they'd already done their own experiments, they would end up in the intervention group. And we would then have those a little bit less enthusiastic about it in the control group. And then we wouldn't know if it was their prior interest or if it was the intervention that actually made the difference. So what we did instead was that they signed up, and then we said you can either be in a control group or an intervention group. And then they were simply randomized. And then afterwards, of course, you try to control for student background, parents' background, and so on, and hopefully you have all the possible variables. They are divided equally, and the only stable variable is the actual intervention. That's what you try to control for afterwards. This is the methodology that the Danish Ministry of Education uses for pedagogical experiments and wants to use, because it's considered the so-called gold standard of empirical experiments. A lot of things can be said about this, and a lot of things can be criticized about this, but this is the way to go now if you want fundings in a Danish context. So, this is what happened. All these 3,000 children, we collected standardized reading tests and math tests from them before the intervention started. From each kid, we collected one writing sample as well. A sample group was asked to do interviews, and then all the parents also did questionnaires, so we had some survey data. And then half of the children, they then got the so-called intervention. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what an intervention is. It's all online. Some of it is even in English, so if you log on to this web page, you can see what the parents got. The main focus was, of course, on reading. So the parents got 4 free books, 2 fiction books and 2 non-fiction books. Then we developed a reading guide and a booklet, and I'll show you them in a while. We filmed a film to scaffold parents in their reading, to scaffold parents and to show parents what a good practice is when you read and talk to your kid around books. That was texted or had speak in 7 different languages. The materials that we gave to the parents were also translated. and then the children got a reading contract. Yes?
Clarification, the books were in the home language?
No, the books were all in Danish.
Okay, but the material for the parents was
Yes,
translated
that was
to
in,
Danish.
yeah.
Thank you.
Because we wanted to target, that's a good question, because we really wanted to target minority language parents. And unfortunately, there are not a big selection of books in home languages in Danish. If there is even, if we can even talk about a selection, there is nothing. It has to be ordered from Sweden, or it has to be ordered from the UK. So that was out of the question. What we then did is we thought, well, what we tried to tell the parents is it doesn't matter what language you read in. You can read in any language. Just read and talk in the language you feel more comfortable in. But then we needed to, to get the message to them. So we developed these booklets and reading guides, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them later on. And they were translated, and then we also thought, well, what about the mother who's not very comfortable reading? So they were also filmed, these reading guides. So what it says in the reading guide, she can also see in a film. In January, they got new books, and they got a reading list, a list of good books to read in the home. The parents got a read aloud book. They got tickets for museums, and they also got an at-home work with math material. We were very interested in trying, not to only build upon this classic middle-class teacher mom way of using books, and so we actually initially wanted to put in a small construction task as well. We wanted to send them a little bird's house that they could build, because the most important is not necessarily reading or actually sitting down on your couch with a book, but to do something and to create those conversations and to create those nice half an hour around talking about meaning and language and so on. But it was logistically it was impossible to do that. So that's why we included museum tickets, math material, and other things that we thought would broaden up a little bit what we thought could go on in this during the intervention. So the parents got a reading guide, and I'll show you that in a while, but they also got a booklet on reading development, and there were some very important points in this booklet. And now I'll try to explain how we are building on Halliday and Painter in this booklet, and how we try to design the intervention around them. So they say that a good starting point for talk is shared experience. So we, of course, build a shared experience into the intervention. We gave them books to read or museum trips, so something to talk about. They also say that guidance and scaffolding comes from a more expert language user. So we instructed the parents that the talk around the books and meaning making must be between a more expert language user, a parent, and a kid. Then we, in our reading guides, we tried to give the parents a good model. We told them that what they should be focusing on is understanding, not pronunciation, not speed, not how the kids read aloud, but the understanding of what the kid would read aloud or the parents would read aloud. We gave them models for posing open-ended questions about the text and its meaning. And we try to get the message across. It's not about correcting, it's about praising. And we also told them, we tried to give this message to them that literacy competencies are actually, they're not fixed or stable. If your child is in year 2 and not good at reading, that can change, and you can help change it. Because some parents might have the idea that you're either good at reading or not good at reading. And there's only so much we can do about it, and there's only so much I can do about it. So this idea that literacy competencies are not stable, but can and will develop, and that you can do something about it with very, very little and very simple tools, was what we tried to put in this booklet that they got. So this is the reading guide. And you can see it also takes inspiration from dialogic reading, if some of you know this methodology. First, we had a really, really long reading guide, and we scripted a lot of questions, and we took inspiration from very direct inspiration also from David Rose's work on interaction, and we did a pilot in a school, and we asked. We had a group of Turkish moms who then were asked to do an interview. And then when we asked them how they used this reading guide, they said, "What reading guide? Oh, that long one. No, we didn't use that. It was too long." So we cut it dramatically. So what they said instead is that they used the general advice on reading and reading development because it was printed on thick paper, and they put it up they put it somewhere visible in the kitchen. So we took that idea from our pilot test and said, well, we'll just do another one of those and just a general one, and invite them to put it up on the fridge or something. And we did a similar one with the museum visits. So can you? It looks like that. We don't know how many kids actually went to the museum yet, but we have collected that data, but we haven't. We're only in the process of calculating all the data, and it was translated. This is in Somali. And if you log onto the website, you can see the films, and you can see them in the various languages. In the film, you will see this father and his son, and you will see the father take a book and sit down and start asking, "Oh, so what do you think this book is about? Let's look it through," and ask questions about the pictures. And you will hear the son read a bit, and the father ask questions about, "So what does that remind you of? Anything you've read before, anything you knew beforehand," and so on. So these pictures come from the film. This is a little book they got with children's literature, and the school libraries were informed about this, and they actually contributed to this list so that we were sure that when the kids then had read something about a book that he or she would like to read, then they would actually be in the school library. Then they had a reading contract. It says reading contract here. And every time they would read with their parents at home, they would put down the dates and the title of the book. And when they had read 10 books, they would get a sticker. So in the class, there would be this big poster, and then they would put up stickers.
In the class, so if we're talking about being randomized, was it like just, how would that operate in a classroom setting?
That good question, very good question, because they were randomized on class level. So 2A would be in the intervention, but 2B might not be in the intervention. Yeah. So it would be in 2A only. Yeah, it had to be randomized at class level. We also talked about should it be at school level, because the teacher in 2A could easily talk to the teacher in 2B and say, "Oh, I got this really good idea for," and then we have a so-called spillover. That's what it's called in. So here's the data that we collected. We collected very different kind of data and a lot of data. As you can see, standardized test scores, they are our main data source because that is the way we measure if it worked. We have to use standardized tests to see that. And then we collected the text that I will show you in a little while, and we also did the interviews and the survey, collected survey data. And as I said, we also collected text samples. We collected narratives from all the kids, both the kids in the intervention group and the kids in the control group. And we did this because we thought this was a unique possibility to actually get a large database of written texts. And also because normally when you do these kind of studies, you normally only collect this kind of data. You collect data where the children are not very active, where the children are responding. These are these classical IT-based standardized testing that's done on a computer, and we wanted some productive language from the children as well. So therefore we collected written narratives. We actually collected both written and oral narratives. A small sample of about 260 children were also invited to come and do an oral narrative, but we don't have any data, we don't have any results from that yet, so I can't say anything about the correlation there yet. We designed this part of the study in such a way that it was safe for us to compare the children's writing across classrooms and across schools and across contexts. So all the children got this writing assignment as their pre-text writing assignment. The teacher got a letter about how to actually do this in class. We couldn't go out to all the classes and see if they actually did it, but the teachers were instructed quite in details on how to perform this in classroom. So we have data on how much time the teachers spent on these assignments. So we know that they didn't give them a week to write it or 2 days to write it. They were supposed to write them within 45 minutes. And we know that if they didn't use 45 minutes, they used 20 minutes, the kids, on writing it. So as you can see, it's designed as a small narrative. There's a guy who goes to the mall with his mom, and then he loses sight of his mom, and then we've left this one blank for the children to imagine what could go on and how this could be resolved, and then the final resolution. This was sent out to 2,973 children, and we got 2,727 back, filled out actually. So that's a very big success rate. What we don't know is what happened to the last 200. We don't know if they were the ones who were not able to write anything. We did get some really, really bad texts that were non-text, texts where the kid had just written via university college or just drawn something. So we did get those kind of texts, but we don't know what we could be missing. You know, the kids who are not the good, who are definitely for whom it was too difficult, this task. And this was the post-test, and again you can see it's very similar to the pre-text. Now the response rate is a little bit lower. That's understandable. And again you can see there's a little story going on here. A guy who's at the beach and sees somebody who's drowning, and then in the end the person is saved. And again, the procedure was the same. The teachers got the instructions on how to carry this out in their classrooms. We tried also to design this in such a way that we thought that this would be something that the children had tried before. We know that this kind of writing assignment is very normal in the early years of schooling in Denmark. And we also thought that going to the mall and going to the beach is a very common thing to do for children in year 2 and 3, because Aarhus has a lot of malls, and Aarhus also has beaches. So what did we do with these texts once we got them in? It's important to remember that this is done. We needed these texts so we could screen the children. We could see if there was any growth in their writing abilities after the intervention. So we needed to screen the text for this purpose. And when we looked at how you do this, we saw a very interesting tendency. We saw that there's a lot of work on quantitative writing analysis in the US, but we could also see that most of it seemed to be informed by proceedings in mathematics and statistics, and very little by linguistic and writing theory. So every time a new way of assessing written language comes out, it's because there's been some development in mathematics or in the ways that computers can assess children's writing. So we thought that there's a space here for us to qualify these ways of assessing large databases of written text, and actually introducing some linguistic theory and some writing theory into these assessment procedures. And I said that why we wanted to do this was because we could get this big database of written text, but it's also because that there's a small paradise island here in the Danish school system. Writing is never assessed. Writing is assessed by teachers every day. We don't know much about it, but we don't have any systematic knowledge about how children write. So we thought that here's also a starting point for developing a tool for assessing writing that can help teachers to do it in an effective but also a valid way. And some teachers say, why didn't we just leave it? Why didn't we just leave writing to teachers and and not interfere, not try to develop some tool for that as well. So as I said, we had 2,722 pre-text, 2,297 post-text. So quite a big return rate. This had to be coded, and we had 2 coding assistants, and they worked for a full year. So we had a full year of 2 full-time employed research assistants doing this. And we had to fit the coding within that frame. And even though it does sound like a lot of time, we had to train them, and we had to actually make sure that they finished the coding, and we had to make sure that the coding was reliable. So the result was that we had to develop a coding tool that took no longer than 20 minutes per text. And the text looked something like this. This is in Danish, of course. This is from year 3. And in English, this is what he writes. Mary, and I've tried to, keep the spelling and the grammar errors, to translate them so that you can get an idea. Mary and its boy Tommy was out in the center to shop. Suddenly the mom is gone, and the boy Tommy became totally confused. He cries and yells, "Mom," but there is no one who is answering. He does not know what to do. He cries and cries. But now he got an idea. An old lady came walking by. He went over to her and asked her, "Can I borrow your mobile?" The lady said yes. They called. The lady spoke with the mom. She ran to the boy and they gave each other a hug. Now Tommy and Mary are together again. Best regards. And then the name. So this is a year 2 text. So we had to code this in 20 minutes, and we had to make sure the coding could actually tell us about progress. So the coding had to be consistent and had to meet the standards of coding and of assessment theory, of course, but we also would like it to be in line with and congruent with theories of language that we thought would give us some valid information about how these children are writing. The first thing we did was, of course, to make sure that this tool can work independently of the coder. So when we looked through the literature and saw what methods were used, we found a lot of coding tools that says, so is the text coherent? Is there an acceptable is there an acceptable length of sentences? Are the noun groups long and complex enough? And those kind. And we immediately understood that we could not use that because that's highly subjective, and it would be hard to get even just 2 people agree on what is okay coherent and what is varied what is okay varied. So instead, we came across this in the literature, and the reason why we like this is because it doesn't use these subjective evaluations. It simply counts, and you can't disagree on counting. So what this does is called the narrative assessment. Hang on, it should be here. Yeah. There it is. The narrative assessment protocol. It simply counts how many complex sentences are there, how many noun phrases, how many prepositional phrases, how many nouns in the pluralized form, how many regular past tense verbs, and so on and so on. And it also counts how many of these kind of constructions, auxiliary and main verb constructions, and how many what they call tier 2 verb. And those are verbs that are not necessarily part of what is the everyday language of a 10-year-old, for instance. And they could actually compare to some lists of words. We didn't have that in Danish, so we had to put a little bit of interpretation into that one. This was validated. It had been used in several studies and had shown to be an effective way of coding text. So we thought that would be a good starting point. But as you can see, it also lacks everything that I said before. It lacks theory of writing. It lacks theory of language. And it all goes on. It only codes things between, that all goes on within the same sentence. There is no notion of narrative as something that unfolds in 2 or more sentences, or that evolves in stages and so on. And then there was another problem, that it's only been done in English, and it's only been done in oral language and preschool children's language. So we would have to know if it worked on Danish school children's language as well. So therefore we turn to linguistic theory, and we turn to the functional model of language. Because we could add everything that is above the sentence level, and we could also add the part of narrative, the narrative competencies that has to do with the text and the discourse level. What we could see that we could use this for was to use the notion of language as layered, and of the stratification idea of language, so that we could actually, if we have a sentence like he found himself completely alone in the shopping mall, he was totally confused, that will actually be coded on several layers, because it will be coded as a clause complex. We will actually code the noun groups, and we will also code the fact that the noun groups, there is a verbal group, and we will code the fact that there is a non-standard choice of words, and we will also code it as something that goes on in a narrative. We will code it as evaluation phase of a narrative. So when we applied this, we could code both lexicogrammatical, discourse level, and genre level items in the language. Not coding if they worked, or if they were appropriate, or if they were good, but simply that they were there. So we coded, I translated this from Danish, and in the Danish SFL terms, we actually have conjunctions, but we have something we call binders, and it doesn't really, some of you are nodding, but it works on a textual level. So we could code for, we coded for the lexicogrammatical items, the textual, the things that tie the text together on a textual level as well, and again the genre, how the genre unfolds. What we coded is there an orientation, yes or no? Is there complication? Is there a revolution? And is there evaluation within this narrative that the children wrote? So in genre and structure, is there an orientation? It was coded 1 or 0. Is there a complication? 1 or 0. Is there a resolution? 1 or 0. Or is there evaluation? 1 or 0. So you could score from 0 to 5 points within, 4 points within. So you can actually do some statistics on it afterwards. We're not saying that this is an SFL-based way of coding. We're saying it's an SFL-informed way of coding, that we try to integrate a more linguistic, a more theoretically informed view of language, and especially about what a narrative is in our coding, because that was absolutely absent in the literature. Yeah, so this is what we coded. Appearance of writing, is the child mixing capital letters and with other letters? Is it standing on the line? Clause complexes, we counted how many are there. Sorry. Theme rime. Is there anything, what we would like to see? I don't think I explained that really well, but we took the starting point. There's a default way of writing a sentence, and that is in Danish putting the subject, the participant, who is the doer, in the front, and anything else than that was coded, was counted. So when they use this beginning of the sentence to do something else, like here to signal now we are going on to a more to a complication part of the story, then that was coded. And then we also coded these. And genre and structure, of course. And here's an example. Mommy and its boy Tommy was out in the center to shop. Suddenly the mom is gone. So we have an orientation, we have a complication, and then what we are especially interested in is the evaluation part. Because the structure is very much given by the pictures that they see, only that one is missing. But what we would like to see is, can the children stop the action and tell us what the people are thinking, feeling? We haven't done the statistics on that part of the coding yet, but we hope to see that is something that can be I personally hope that there must be an effect there, that they will become better at that when they become better at reading.
Is there any coding for an imaginative aspect of the text as well?
No, and yeah, and but that's an yes, good point. Hold on to that one because we called it. I don't know if you noticed it, but I called this part of the talk from the lab to the classroom.
Yeah.
No, from the classroom to the lab and back again because that's a very good point. Yeah. So this counting made it very reliable. That they don't disagree on how many noun groups there are. It's just a matter of counting. And poor coders, they sat there with text for a full year and counted and wrote it. They had this. They had to log on to a website to put in all the results, and they were really cross-eyed when I met them every now and then. They had 2 months of training. They were trained. One of them was a trained teacher. The other was a trained linguist. So they had 2 months of training and testing the validity. They're testing, the reliability. Will it measure literacy development? This is the result of the pre and post text, and if it can measure anything about development, we would want to see them move, and they do. So we were home safe on that. We would also like to see that there is an interconnectivity between all the items, and this is. Hang on, sorry about this. So if you're good at writing, you must be good at all of this. It's not enough that you're good at this, and this. Then there's something wrong with our coding, with our notion of what writing is. When you measure something as complex as writing, you can't measure it on one item. You sort of have to break it down into different capacities. But if you have found the right capacities, they must all point in the same direction. So if a child is good at writing, he or she must score high on all of these variables. And that is examined in the data by doing a factor analysis. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with these kind of methods. I don't know if any of you have ever done factor analysis, yeah. But we have, between those NAB items, we had, as we expected, very strong interconnectivity. But when it came to appearance of writing and punctuation, there was no interconnectivity whatsoever. So this tells us that that is not really significant when it comes to if you're writing a good narrative. So that's what we can say to teachers now, quite safely. Don't really worry in year 2 and 3. Don't worry too much about the appearance of the writing. If the children are writing, if they're mixing the letters and so on, because it doesn't seem to be an indicator for good writing, good narrative abilities at least. What we could see, and that is maybe not very surprising, that the longer the text, the better the writing, of course. And that is because it has to do with year 2 and 3 narrative competencies. That's not very surprising. What we were not happy to see is that the results for cohesion and for genre were less robust. There's still interconnectivity, but it's not as strong as these NAB items, unfortunately. We will have to look more into this. We'll also have to look more into subgroups and see how they did. Maybe it's because it's simply too difficult still, for instance, in year 2 to master the genre, to master evaluation, for instance. Then, of course, if we would also like to see that those who are good at writing also score high in the national testing, because we would like to see that, because we're quite sure that the national test, they actually test student abilities. Because we know that from these huge databases that we have now of all the Danish children, and we know that they're very good predictors of later years, writing abilities. We know they're good predictors of the exams they get in year 9 as well. So we would also like to see that those who are good at writing also score high in these standardized tests, and they did. So what about as you said, what about, is it relevant? Is is it, can we tell teachers, oh, just have your year 2 and year 3 children write long narratives and they'll be good at writing, just count the words and count the sentences. Of course, that's not enough. I have an MA student, and she has taken all these items and she's boiled them down to 5 questions, and one is about how is this narrative, how does it unfold as a narrative, how many ideas are there, how creative is it? And she's taking the other ones about clause complexes, about noun groups, prepositional groups, and so on. And she has narrowed it down to 5 simple questions, and then the teachers are going to score the texts on those 5 questions. What we will do then, we did a small pile of it, so we know that the teachers understand the questions. And what we'll do now is that we will take a small sample of the texts that have already been coded, and then we will ask teachers to evaluate them, but with the 5 simple questions. And what we then would like to see is that we agree with the teachers. Because if we agree with the teachers, and the teachers agree with our coding procedures here, then we can actually take those 5 questions and say, you can be quite sure that if you have a text that scores high on these 5 questions, then it's a good text, because we can now compare it back to these 3,000, well, more than 3,000 texts actually that we coded. So we're now seeking this external validity of this coding. We're going back to the classrooms and see, so how can we take these and what we know about writing abilities in year 2 and 3 and actually turn it into a usable, but also, that's very important, valid and reliable way of assessing writing, assessing narratives in year 2 and 3. And of course, what we haven't looked into yet is all these questions, additional codings. It would be so good to look into more about how are they treating the genre, maybe look a lot more into the appraisal that's going on in the text and do some additional codings on the text. That will take a lot of manpower, so we'll probably have to recruit MA students to do it, who are interested in doing their thesis about it. And of course, what we will also know something about is how does writing develop throughout a school year, and what different dimensions of the writing do develop, and how do they develop, and how are they connected to the reading.